Live from our hurricane headquarters with real-time analysis from some of the nation's top meteorologists, this is Tracking the Tropics, powered by Bose Electric.
El Nino, like a fly swatter, squashing potential storms out of the tropics way before they get anywhere close to the United States. Of course, that's great news for us, but the big question amongst meteorologists is, how long exactly will this trend last? We're going to answer that question this week on Tracking the Tropics, powered by Bose Electric. Hello there to you folks. JB here with you in your hurricane headquarters alongside, of course, WFLA mainstay Rebecca Barry, meteorologist there in the top right-hand portion of your screen, and our featured meteorologist joining us from WGNO in New Orleans, Louisiana, Brantly, Keiek, is joining us. You can use hashtag HeyRebecca or hashtag HeyBrantly to ask one of our meteorologists a question right there in the palm of your hand. But a lot to talk about in the tropics, and to set things off, we're going to send things over to meteorologist Rebecca Barry. And Rebecca, things have changed a lot in the last 24 hours.
They have. Just yesterday afternoon, we were talking about watching 3 areas in the tropics for the potential for development. Now, none of them had a great chance to develop, but we were still watching them. The first one right here, this broad area of unsettled weather, this tropical wave, it had about a 10% chance for develop at one point. Some optimists said 20% at one point. But what we really knew about it the entire time was whether it actually got organized or not, it was going to enhance chances for rain across the southeast as we head into the weekend. Now there's no chance for it to develop. It's just basically juicing up the atmosphere across Florida, across Georgia, across the South Carolina areas, Thursday through about Sunday, as it adds an influx of the moisture. So that one's out of there. We don't have to worry about that one. We were also watching the broad area of circulation just to the south of Puerto Rico. It had about a 20% chance at one point to develop and move into just to the south of Cuba area, but now nothing there either. It's encountering a lot of shear, and it just couldn't get it together. So now we're left with one, and it's just now moving off the coastline of Africa. So we really don't know much about the system at all based on the placement, but you can see that there is a big thunderstorm rolling by the Cabo Verde Islands, and now the National Hurricane Center says that as it trudges past the mid-Atlantic, it will eventually have a 30% chance to develop once it enters this region. And the reason that it's not going to see much of a chance to develop until it gets to this region is because of shear. And so we're looking at a lot of wind shear thanks to, of course, the El Nino pattern across the middle of the Atlantic. The Euro completely ignores this system. The GFS does show it developing once it gets north of Puerto Rico out of that area of wind shear. So if you were to follow the Euro believes that the shear is too strong. It's too much for this system, and it's never going to stay organized enough to get out of the shear and start to see those more tropical characteristics, start to see that pressure drop, start to see those rain bands form. And so the GFS believes it will hold together enough to see that, but it keeps it as a fish storm. It doesn't bring it anywhere near anyone. And so that's the good news, is even if the system forms, it's unlikely to really end up impacting anyone. So let's talk about shear. Shear is stronger across the Atlantic during El Nino. Shear is upper level winds that tear hurricanes apart. Hurricanes build, they power themselves, and they also intensify through vertical development. So when shear basically cuts them off at the top, they're unable to do that. They're unable to get stronger, unable to get more organized, sometimes unable to form. So the areas in red are high shear over the Atlantic. So here's Florida, here's the Bahamas, here's Puerto Rico, and you can see where the shear is the highest right now. Not necessarily over by the Cabo Verde Islands where that system is developing, but as we make our way through the next couple of days, the shear evolves and develops. And so the shear is still a big barrier between where this system is expected to be and getting into the northern Atlantic where it's expected to have a chance to form. And so it has to make it through this large area of wind shear over the weekend. But after the weekend, that does start to erode, and it opens up a little pathway with lighter shear for it to potentially get into a more conducive environment for development. The other part of the factor that we talk about, and it's been very late this year, but it finally showed up to the party, Saharan dust. And there's a huge plume of Saharan dust this weekend over the mid-Atlantic where this system is supposed to be moving through. We know that Saharan dust doesn't in itself kill hurricanes, but the conditions that are conducive for Saharan dust are typically very dry, conditions and pretty strong upper level winds to pull those plumes of Saharan dust across the Atlantic. Now, it does start to erode after the weekend, but even as it does erode, it's pretty close to the areas that this system will be moving to the north of Puerto Rico. And so if this system makes it past that shear, makes it past this area of drier air and Saharan dust, it will be in a more conducive environment once it's to the north of Puerto Rico, and that's when we have the chances for it to potentially develop. Now, with the wind shear being so high this year, I expect we're going to see atypical months. And what I mean by this is we have areas that we normally see per month, the potential for formation. For July, it's just around the Lesser Antilles, but we know that there's a ton of shear there now, and that we had that system that we were watching yesterday in this exact location that didn't end up doing anything. Now, once it gets into the Gulf, we typically have a good chance of development right close to the coastline, and it's similar in the northern Atlantic. It's a more northern development area, and so that does tie into this system potentially making it past all that shear and then getting closer to the North Atlantic and being able to form. So that's ringing true in terms of July formation, but moving into August, it's going to be really interesting because look at where the formation zones are in August, right over the middle of the Atlantic. This is the most likely area we see storms forming in the Atlantic, and you and I both know that's also where we have the strongest Atlantic wind shear typically in an El Nino pattern. So I would not be surprised if this does not ring true for this August because of that shear alone. We talked a lot in the beginning of this season about how it's a war between this warm sea surface temperatures, unprecedented warmth across the Atlantic that we've never had, adding fuel to these storms, and it's a battle against the shear, which is weakening these storms. And one theory we talked about, which is my personal favorite, is we're probably going to see a lot of named systems, but because of the formation zone being shut down, they'll end up forming in odd locations and just being fish storms. And so that would be great. We would love a quiet season in that aspect. Moving into what we've seen so far, here a look at the 2023 hurricane names, and keeping in mind we had one unnamed storm in January. The National Hurricane Center went back and looked at that system and said, nope, even though it was January, that was a tropical system, but they didn't use a name because they did it so far after the fact. And so our second named storm of the season was actually Arlene, and then we had Brett and Cindy, all tropical storms. And if you remember Don, it was a tropical storm for a really long time, and then it briefly intensified into our first hurricane of the season. It was a Category 1 hurricane for a little over 6 hours for the most case, but it was making circles out over the open Atlantic, a big fish storm, and insiders know that my husband's name is Don, so that was also ringing very true for him, not asking directions, doing a lot of U-turns, and fishing.
Tropical Storm Don was persistent,
yes.
I think is a good way to put it. I think
yes.
Don would be okay with that word, right?
Absolutely, and it was also the third longest named and numbered system that we watched because it did make circles for almost 2 weeks, and so it was the third longest that we've been tracking.
Very interesting. Emily, Franklin, and Gert up next as we bring in Brantly Keiek joining us from WGNO in New Orleans. Hey there, Brantly. You know, one of the things that Rebecca didn't mention, but we've been talking about all season long on Tracking the Tropics, these warm sea surface temperatures. And people have this prevailing thought that when the ocean is warm, you get tropical storms and hurricanes. But then you have this season with El Nino. Rebecca did a great job talking about wind shear and how it can break apart systems. That's really been the theme so far this season.
Yeah, and that may continue to be the theme for a good portion of the season. You know, we have the warm waters out there. You may have seen some of the posts on social media recently, or maybe some of the news articles talking about some really hot water close to South Florida. But the warm sea surface temperatures are really just one ingredient for hurricanes. It really does help to act as fuel for some of those storms. But when you have that high wind shear, you have the dusty air out there that's really drying things out, it really makes it more difficult for those storms to get going. So you may have a lot of fuel in place that would potentially fuel a storm, but if the atmospheric conditions are just not right, you might not really see much development at all. Or again, like Rebecca was saying, you may see this development in areas that you typically don't see a lot of storms forming, and those storms just stay out over open water, which of course is good news for us.
Let's also bring up the question that I posed the very beginning of our show today, our Wednesday episode of Tracking the Tropics. And I asked, and I'm going to pose this to each one of you, Rebecca and Brantly. And again, if you guys have your own questions in the comments section, use any of the hashtags on your screen. If you use hashtag #HeyBrantly or hashtag #HeyRebecca with your question or comment, we can animate it on screen, and we will do so here in just a moment. But the question that I posed was, How long is this pattern going to last? We have seen these early areas of disturbance that come across the Atlantic, and then before you know it, they just fade away into non-existence. That has held true for July. Will it hold true for August and September? Really, September being the peak month of hurricane season.
And so I think it's going to certainly test our theories and our knowledge of how much we know about wind shear. And unfortunately, wind shear is the El Nino wind shear is a broader weather pattern. It's not necessarily going to be consistent throughout the season. So if we have weaker wind shear for a week or two in September and August, September and August, which is the peak, we could very well see some storms forming. The shear is not the end all be all answer. It's just what we're most excited about this season, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. I think also, as we get later in the season, something we have to watch for is maybe the storms that form a little bit closer to home in the Gulf and the Caribbean. Once we get to the second half of the season and we start seeing those cold fronts coming back through, sometimes we can see low pressure move over the Gulf or the Caribbean, and that can act to help get a storm started. But you may still have some wind shear across the Atlantic's main development region, so maybe not as many storms coming across the tropical Atlantic, but that doesn't necessarily mean that things might not heat up again in the Caribbean or the Gulf in the second half of the season. So I think this pattern may continue for the next few weeks and the next month or so, but after that, we may have to watch for any development in the Gulf or northern, maybe near the Bahamas, the Caribbean, something like that.
Let's get to some of the comments that are coming in our comment section. If you want to get our attention, use a hashtag to ask a question in our Meteorologist Live Q&A powered by Bose Electric. And Ann is joining us from South Florida, saying that they're getting heat indexes at 111. We've been talking, Rebecca, you and I, and Brantly, of course, has been monitoring this on the northern Gulf Coast as far as these just insane heat indexes that we've been getting, the feels-like temperatures, and just how hot it is out there, a lot in the southeastern United States especially, and other areas of the U.S. as well. Let me bring you guys both up here on screen. Rebecca, if you'd like to answer first, how does that impact hurricane season?
Well, unfortunately, an unprecedented heat wave like we've seen this summer, and it's just not, there's no break in sight. It's not good because, of course, that contributes to warmer sea surface temperatures. And going off of what Brantly just touched on, that we may have to watch for formation closer to shore and in the Gulf, that's terrifying to think about how warm our sea surface temperatures are as a result of the potential climate change, as well as this heat wave that we're seeing. That combination could be such a killer fuel source for these storms if they did form closer to, especially in the Gulf.
Yeah, and of course, we know the warmer the water is, the more evaporation we see. So that increases the humidity, that increases that feels like temperature, and it also just adds more energy to the atmosphere that potential storms could use. So the warmer water, definitely not a good sign, but still, again, just one ingredient. We still have the wind shear out there. We still have that drier air. So for now, it's not a huge deal, but again, it could act as fuel for storms later on in the season.
Does that mean that rapid intensification, Rebecca, is something that could be a concern for us in the weeks and months ahead?
We learn something from every hurricane season, and our focus, but we became laser focused on rapid intensification after Hurricane Andrew, because people went to bed in South Florida to a weaker storm and then woke up to the strongest storm. It rapidly intensified as it approached the Florida coastline in Miami. And so we did look a lot at sea surface temperatures. Scientists looked a lot at the depth of the ocean that it was traveling over, and we learned more about rapid intensification. And my fear this season is that that's what we're at risk of, is a storm forming very quickly close to the coastline, so we don't have those days and days and days to track it and talk about what you could expect, that it spins up very quickly close to the coastline and potentially rapidly intensifies because of those warmer sea surface temperatures.
Let's get to this question that just came in from one of our commenters. Elizabeth wants to know, how far up the coast do the warm waters go? And I mean, the phenomenon of these extremely warm sea surface temperatures, I know that our chief meteorologist here, Rebecca, Jeff Baradelli, has been talking about how that's been impacting the coral reefs down here in Florida. But these insane temperatures, I'll bring Brantly in here as well. Those sea surface temperatures up on the northern Gulf Coast too. I mean, how far regionally are we talking here as far as the ocean just being that hot?
So the Keys is what everyone is focusing on right now because that's where we're seeing the record-breaking hot temperatures. They recorded a 101 degree sea surface temperature yesterday in between Miami and Key Largo, and you're finding multiple readings all around the Keys around 98, 99 degrees, which can hurt the coral. And so that's what everyone's been talking about. Once you get away from the Keys, the temperatures are warm along our coastline, but they're not unusual. We're sitting at 89 here in the Tampa Bay area as far as our ocean temperatures go, and that's actually average for us for this time of the year. And so it's really that basin of the Keys where they haven't had strong winds at all. They haven't had some of the typical other factors that would keep them a little bit cooler. Now out across the middle Atlantic, they're quite warm. But as far as right along the coastline, they're normal in North Florida for this time of the year. They're normal in southwestern Florida for this time of the year. But it's when you're down in the Keys or out over the open Atlantic and some parts of the Gulf are abnormally warm. What are you seeing, Brantly?
Well, for the most part, our temperatures have just been about a degree or two above normal for this time of the year. We did have a pretty big heat wave a few weeks ago, and that really made things heat up on the surface. But after we had some heavy rainfall, things started to mix a little bit more and temperatures came back down. So we're not seeing those record-breaking temperatures, but it is near normal for this time of the year so far. So really haven't seen too much in the way of heating. But of course, the hurricanes help take some of that heat content out of the water, and we haven't seen really many storms so far this year. So we still have a lot of heat content there to use.
Brantly, how are things up there in New Orleans? For a period of several years, it was just one after the other. We've had, of course, your chief meteorologist, Hank Allen, who's a great friend of the program, on multiple times in the last couple of years. And he has talked about New Orleans and just how there's just tremendous fatigue when it comes to tropical development up there. How are things lately?
People, yeah, they're still tired. They still don't want to see any storms. So, of course, everyone's, counting their blessings as we saw a fairly quiet season last year, hoping for the same this year. But people here are very resilient. They're prepared. And just in case, we've had a lot of local agencies, a lot of local groups that have already started preparing for potentially a busy second half of the year, because that's what some of these longer range models are showing. So people are still a little tired. That storm fatigue definitely still around, but I think people are more prepared now because of the lessons they've learned from having so many storms over the past few years.
Yeah, and when you see this graphic that Rebecca just pulled up here, Brantly, and you see those tropical development, formation zones, and those arrows pointing right into your, neck of the woods, it's just not what people in New Orleans or on the North Gulf Coast want to see.
Yeah, absolutely not. But I will say, I think people over the past few years, maybe not becoming desensitized to seeing so many storms form, but they definitely pay more attention. So I guess there's less panic now whenever a storm pops up. A lot of people say, okay, we have some time to watch this, and they kind of take it one day at a time as those storms develop and get a little bit closer. So I think even though we've seen a lot of storms and we still have that storm fatigue, it has helped people become more aware of what's going on and how to find those resources to help plan in case a hurricane does start coming toward us.
Protect Cafe Du Monde at all costs.
Yes,
all right.
national treasure.
Protect the beignets. We'll end out our show with one final question, and it's a cheeky one, and it comes in from Steve saying #KJB. Is this the beginning of the end of the world with all the records being broken continuously lately? It might feel like it. We walk outside, you guys, and we feel like we are in an oven. I mean, it really does feel that way. How long, Rebecca, is this pattern expected to last?
We don't really have a break in our pattern locally for a while. In fact, we just saw a wind shift, and so we're not seeing westerly winds anymore, which actually kept our coastal zones in the upper 80s instead of the 90s. Starting tomorrow, especially, we're going to see scorching temperatures in the mid-90s all the way out to the beaches because of southeasterly winds. So it's actually going to get even hotter than we've been for the past couple of days. And we do not usually see a break in the heat until mid to late September. Maybe even October.
Wow. Yeah.
And so it's the thick of things right now.
Yeah, for us here, we had our heat index up to about 115 to about 120 for a couple of weeks. And then we saw our humidity actually come down for about a week, and everyone was very grateful for that. But it looks like now we're starting to see those southerly winds bring that moisture back in from the Gulf. So we're going to see our humidity start to go back up, and of course, our heat index going up as well. So the heat is here to stay. It looks like we're going to be stuck with it for a while.
That's not what we want to hear, but we, of course, appreciate our featured meteorologist joining us today on Tracking the Tropics, Brantly Keiek, joining us from WGNO. Brantly, you and the team over there at WGNO, what are some of the things you're going to be monitoring in the weeks, months ahead as as hurricane season continues to unfold?
Well, of course, if anything pops up, we're watching it. We're tracking the tropics, so we're going to have updates on any sort of development that the Hurricane Center is keeping an eye on. But again, so far things have been pretty quiet, and we really look towards the second half of August into September was when we start to get a little bit more concerned about the Gulf. That's typically when we see those really warm temperatures, the hottest water temperatures of the year. So that's usually when we start to really see an increase in activity for us here on the northern Gulf Coast. But of course, any storms that are coming across the Atlantic are worth watching, especially as they move into the Caribbean as well.
Brantly Keiek joining us from WGNO in New Orleans. Brantly, we appreciate you taking some time out of your day to join us on Tracking the Tropics. All the best to you as hurricane season continues to unfold. Hopefully, that fly swatter that we call El Nino will continue squashing these areas of disturbance as they trek across the Atlantic, but we'll, of course, be utilizing meteorologists just like yourself over the course of this season of Tracking the Tropics. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much to Brantly, of course. Thank you to meteorologist Rebecca Barry for providing us with the latest here in your hurricane headquarters. Tracking the Tropics is live every Wednesday during hurricane season at 12:30 Eastern, 11:30 Central, and we also have additional storms and coverage when storms form. We are live, of course, on WFLA.com, the WFLA app, next to our sister station websites and apps across the country. And then, of course, if you want to listen to us, yes, the weather nerds out there, you want to listen to our conversations, you can do so on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts. Thanks so much for joining us on this edition of Tracking the Tropics, powered by Bose Electric. For Brantly and Rebecca, we'll see you next time here from your hurricane headquarters.
Find Tracking the Tropics on these platforms. And for storm updates, the latest models, and helpful resources, visit trackingthetropics.tv.